Welcome everyone to today's presentation on border imaginaries, symbolic borders, and metaphors and images of migration, the Australian case. My name is Janina Schlüsselburg, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of New South Wales. I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia, and due to the time difference, this lecture has been pre-recorded. However, I will try to make it as engaging as possible. At some stage during this lecture, I will ask you for your opinion, which I welcome you to write down using the Zoom chat function. This is my first time pre-recording a lecture, so let's see how this turns out. As I prepared this lecture, the recent political landscape in Germany offers a stark reminder of the polarizing nature of migration debates. This context is crucial. These dynamics underscore the global significance of how we imagine, construct, and visualize borders. The German debates highlight how border imaginaries are not just academic concepts, but lived political realities that shape national identities, social tensions, and human experiences. Today, we'll explore how borders are not just physical lines on a map, but complex dynamic constructs shaped by images, metaphors, and collective imagination. So let me share my screen with you now. Our journey today will take us through a comparative analysis of visual patterns in German and Australian media coverage of migration. We'll explore how these images work to create border imaginaries, from depictions of anonymous masses to victimized individuals to empowered agents. What's particularly fascinating is how these visual patterns transcend national boundaries, creating shared narratives that influence both public perception and policy decisions. Some of the concepts we'll discuss today might sound familiar to you already, and I'm particularly excited to share this research with you, as Greta Olson's work has been foundational to my own approach in analyzing these cross-cultural patterns. By the end of this presentation, I hope to demonstrate how media organizations play a crucial role in constructing these symbolic boundaries that shape our migration debates. Understanding these visual metaphors and their impact is essential for developing a more nuanced appreciation of how migration discourse operates in our increasingly connected world. I will briefly walk you through today's presentation. Let's begin by setting the tone and positioning this research within its broader context. Through this presentation, I aim to provide you with an inside overview of the key themes and analytical frameworks that guide our study. As we navigate these complex and often controversial topics, it's crucial that we approach the material with a critical, nuanced, and empathetic mindset. The outline on the screen provides a roadmap for our discussion. We'll start by examining why I have chosen to focus on images of migration in the global north. From there, we'll take a closer look at the Australian case, considering how it fits into the broader visual landscape. We'll then explore the concept of border imaginaries, the ways in which borders are constructed and visualized, both physically and symbolically. This will lead us to examine the various typologies and discourses surrounding the representation of migration. And finally, we'll investigate how these visual narratives transcend national boundaries, touching on the themes of securitization, metaphor, and counter-discourses. So let's begin our journey through the visual landscapes of migration. I assume that by now you're already familiar with the research group MeDiMi. However, let me briefly contextualize my work. MeDiMi, which stands for Menschenrechtsdiskurse in der Migrationsgesellschaft, or Human Rights Discourse in Migration Societies, works as an interdisciplinary research group and has a profound impact on my research. In partnership with my colleague, Dr. Laura Borchardt, We embarked on a comprehensive study that analyzes these visual narratives surrounding migration. Our research focuses on magazine covers from the German and the US American context, which were published between 2015 and 2023. We selected our cover images that sit at the critical intersection of human rights and migration discourse. Today, I will not only present our key theoretical framework from our study, crucially, I will extend our analysis by introducing the Australian perspective. As we progress, I invite you to look beyond the surface of these images. Consider how visual representation is never neutral. It is a powerful tool for constructing social understanding, shaping public discourse, and ultimately influencing human rights perspectives. So let's dive deeper into this research methodology and the visual landscapes that are unfolding. Why focus on images of migration in the global north? Today, I want to explore why studying images of migration in the global north is crucial for understanding how borders and migration are constructed in public discourse. First, let's consider visual translatability. While different cultures have their own specific ways of representing migration, we see remarkably similar visual tropes appearing across the Western world. Think about how images of boats, walls, orange life jackets, or masses of people have become universal symbols in migration discourse. This isn't coincidental. It reflects a shared visual language about borders and mobility. These consistent visual patterns don't just represent borders. They actively participate in constructing what we understand borders to be. But this raises fundamental questions. What actually are borders? How do they come into existence? We often think of borders as natural or fixed, but they're socially constructed through various means: legal frameworks, social practices, and crucially, through visual representations. The way we visually distinguish between citizens and migrants plays a key role in this construction. As Julia, Raki, and Gorjo point out in their 2022 work, there's a stark contradiction in how we handle human mobility. While we talk about relocation and movement, the reality often involves incarceration, captivity, and imprisonment. This tension is central to understanding modern border regimes. We see this in how terms like refugee camps or asylum seeker facilities or Flüchtlingslager effectively mask detention centers where individuals are being incarcerated. What's particularly significant is how migration patterns remain deeply rooted in historical inequalities. Contemporary migration is primarily driven by systemic inequalities and violence, grounded in the legacies of a colonial and neocolonial past. We're looking at continuing patterns of poverty, oppression, and conflict in the global south that directly shape migration flows. But often these historical and structural circumstances that are the driving factors for migration and mobility practices are ignored in the discussion of migration in the global north media. When we analyze these images through a cultural legal approach, we see how the global north has developed a common understanding of migration and borders. These shared visual narratives don't just reflect policies, they actively shape how the public understands and responds to migration. The key insight here is that while these images might appear merely descriptive, they're actually performing crucial work in constructing our understanding of borders, citizenship, and belonging. They are part of a larger system that educates the public about who belongs and who doesn't belong. The visual representation of migration in the global north reveals both shared understanding of borders and common approaches to managing human mobility. This general framing helps us to understand not just what these images show, but what they do. how they work to construct and maintain particular understandings of borders, migration, and national identity in the global north. When analyzing images of migration, I'm concerned with the following questions. How are borders constructed through visual representation? How is citizenship visually distinguished from migration? What are the roles of images in perpetuating or challenging power structures? What are the connections between visual tropes and policy approaches? By focusing on dramatic visuals of border crossings of masses of people, these representations often direct attention away from the deeper historical inequalities and structural conditions that drive migration in the first place. So before we go deeper in exploring some of the theoretical concepts on borders and migration, I would like to start with a campaign by the Australian government, Department of Home Affairs, which was first launched in 2015 and then relaunched in 2019. This campaign from the Australian government, just to make this clear, it is published from the Australian government, was translated into 17 languages and, among other things, posted as Facebook ads to targeted audiences. I would like you to take a couple of minutes now, think about what you are about to see here, and then just write down your first thoughts that come to your mind via the Zoom chat functions. You can use words, sentence, or even emojis, whatever you like, just to record that on the chat. Okay, thank you for that, and I look forward to reading your first impressions later. So, what are border imaginaries? Let me introduce some key concepts that will help us analyze what we've just seen here. At the heart of our discussions are border imaginaries. But what exactly are they? Border imaginaries, or images of migration, serve as what Julia Raki and Gojo call a pedagogy of crisis in Western societies. They work to normalize fear of migrants, justify exceptional border measures, and quietly legitimize violence under the banner of security. Think of them as powerful visual tools that shape how we understand and respond to migration. To better analyze these imaginaries, I'd like to share three crucial visual cues identified by Julia Raki and Gojo. These cues help us recognize when and how migrants are being dehumanized or victimized in visual representations. The first is silencing. This isn't just about keeping quiet. It's about the systematic omission of migrant voices from discussions about their own lives and experiences, and the complete absence of any visual representation. When we look at global North media coverage of migration, we need to ask ourselves, who's actually doing the talking here? Research consistently shows that it's mainly politicians, lawmakers, and authorities speaking about migrants, rather than migrants speaking for themselves. The second visual cue is collectivization, sometimes also called generalization. Here, migrants are reduced to group identities, defined primarily by nationality, and sometimes by age or gender. Notice how rarely we hear individual names or learn about people's professions or personal stories. This creates a depersonalizing effect in global North narratives, where individual identities disappear into a faceless collective. Finally, we have decontextualization. This involves showing migrants in situations disconnected from the actual experiences of flight or hardship, effectively veiling the violence and difficulties they face. It's a form of symbolic bordering that misrepresents migrants as what has been called historical subjects, divorced from their current reality and circumstances. These three mechanisms, silencing, collectivization, and decontextualization, work together to shape our understanding of borders and migration. As we continue, we'll see how these elements appear in various media representations and campaign materials. Now that we understand these three visual cues, let's explore how borders are actually constructed through what Chouliaraki and Godot call border assemblage. This concept helps us understand that territorial borders aren't just lines on a map. They are created through various performative border control practices. Think about it in two layers. First, we have the territorial physical border. We have the legal acknowledgement of borders and nations, the official recognition that establishes where one country ends and another begins. Second, we have the physical security measures at entry points, something like passport checks or biometric scanning. But there's something fascinating happening beyond these tangible elements. This is where symbolic borders come into play, and this is particularly relevant for our analysis of media representations. Border imaginaries do something quite powerful. They blend territorial, physical borders with symbolic ones, creating metaphorical boundaries of inside and outside through media representation. They are constructed through language, images, narratives that create mental boundaries between us and them. An essential point here is that symbolic borders aren't fixed. They are constantly being negotiated and reconstructed through media representations. Each news story, each image, each headline contributes to either reinforcing or challenging these invisible but powerful boundaries. What's particularly interesting is how these different aspects of border intersect and influence each other. Take news journalism, for example. When media outlets cover stories about illegal migrants or dangerous sea crossings, they're not just reporting on events at the territorial border. They are simultaneously operating at the symbolic level, shaping our imaginaries about security, humanitarianism, and migration. These networks of meaning don't stay neatly in one dimension. Instead, they cut across both territorial and symbolic borders, blurring the lines between them. This process actively shapes the identities and relationships of everyone involved, from the migrants themselves to the societies receiving them, from policymakers to the general public consuming these media narratives. This complex interplay between physical and symbolic borders helps explain why border imaginaries are so powerful in shaping public discourse and policy decisions about migration. Okay, now that we understand border imaginaries and their mechanisms, I want to introduce a typology of migrant representation that builds on Greta Olson and Janna Wessel's work. We'll see how the visual cues of silencing, collectivization, and decontextualization operate within the categories and how they contribute to symbolic border construction. First, let's look at dehumanizing representations, which appear in three distinct forms. Type 1A focuses on deliberate dehumanization to provoke anti-immigration sentiments. Here, collectivization is the dominant method. Think about images of large, anonymous crowds shot from the distance. These visual choices strip individuals of their identity, presenting migration as an overwhelming, faceless phenomenon. This creates powerful symbolic borders by visually reinforcing the distinction between us and them. Type 1B uses similar dehumanizing techniques, but for a different purpose, to criticize politicians or political positions. Here, we often see both collectivization and decontextualization at work. Migrants literally become visual props in political arguments, removed from their original context. Even when the intent is to critique anti-immigration policies, this approach ironically reinforces symbolic borders by treating migrants as abstract symbols rather than individuals. Type 1C involves what we call ethnosexualizing images. These combine dehumanization with racialized and gendered stereotypes. Through decontextualization, these images strip away individual circumstances and histories, reducing to stereotypical representations, while simultaneously fueling cultural and racial anxieties. Our second major category involves victimization, what we term negative humanitarian representations. While these images might seem more sympathetic, they often employ silencing in a subtle way. Close-up shots of distressed faces, especially women and children, or people in invisible hardship at camps or borders, may show individuals but rarely give them any agency or voice. The symbolic border here operates through the creation of a helpless other in need of the global North's intervention. The third category actively challenges these symbolic borders, appearing in two forms. Type 3A shows migrants as rights holders, directly countering silencing by visually emphasizing their legal status and legitimate claims. These images might show people engaging with legal processes or participating in protests, actively speaking and claiming their rights. Type 3B presents what we call heroicizing images. These actively resist collectivization by portraying migrants not just as individuals with agency, but as powerful agents of change and resistance. These images show people as strong, determined protagonists who actively challenge the status quo. What's particularly significant here is how these images capture moments of collective and individual resistance. Whether it's a raised fist at a demonstration or a direct gaze into the camera that challenges the viewer's assumptions, or people actively rebuilding their lives on their own terms. These images work to dissolve symbolic borders, not just by emphasizing shared human experiences, but by showing migrants as transformative actors who refuse to accept the recurrent narratives of migration. They present a counter-narrative to both the dehumanizing and victimizing representations, showing people who are actively reshaping their circumstances and challenging dominant power structures. Finally, our fourth category represents perhaps the ultimate form of silencing, the complete absence of representation. Here we see empty boats, abandoned life jackets, barbed wire fences, or landscapes, but no actual people. This transforms migration from a human experience into an abstract phenomenon that needs to be managed or controlled. The symbolic border here is created through the complete erasure of human presence, reducing migration to a technical or administrative issue. I won't be engaging with all of these representational forms in detail today. However, I will make sure to include relevant visual examples of some of the key categories we've identified. Now that we understand these different types of representation, I want to focus on how secularization discourse operates in media coverage of migration. This discourse is especially important because it typically manifests through three distinct visual patterns we've just discussed: dehumanizing images, ethnosexualizing representations, and perhaps most tellingly, the complete absence of migrant representation. Let me explain what I mean by secularization discourse, drawing on the work from Nicolas de Genova and Julia Raki. At its core, secularization discourse does something quite powerful. It transforms migration from a normal aspect of human movement into a security issue, a threat that needs to be controlled and contained. This transformation happens through specific visual techniques that systematically detach migration from its broader context. Think about it. Human mobility has always been part of human nature. It's nothing new. Yet, these representations strip away this historical context, presenting migration as what Nicolas de Genova calls a crisis, as if it was a sudden, unexpected emergency requiring extraordinary measures. What's striking here is how this discourse constructs migrants as what Julia Raki and Gorjo call unknownable strangers. Through visual choices, media representation creates a fundamental division between us and them. These representations don't show you the teacher, the engineer, the parent, or the student. Instead, they reduce complex human beings with diverse talents and experiences to one single narrative, that of the illegal trying to find a back door. The power of this approach lies in what it doesn't show as much as what it does. When we see empty boats, surveillance equipment, or warning signs, instead of human faces, we are witnessing securitization discourse in its purest form, the complete transformation of human mobility into a security issue. Okay, let's go back to the campaign from the Australian government that is actually called Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders. This is a rich example of securitization discourse and border imaginaries that perfectly demonstrate the framework that I've just presented. Let me show you how border imaginaries are constructed to make these concepts more graspable. Looking at Australia's No Way campaign posters in detail, we can examine how they construct what I introduced to you earlier on as a pedagogy of crisis in Western societies. This campaign provides a perfect case study of how visual cues work together to create powerful border imaginaries. Let's start with silencing. The most striking aspect of these materials, perhaps. The bold red no way message, repeated across multiple languages, might seem like communication. But let's think about who's actually speaking here. It's a one-way command from the Australian government, with Border Patrol officers and lawmakers as the only authorized voices here. The perspective of migrants themselves, completely erased. The visual elements reinforce the silencing in multiple ways. Look at what the campaign chooses to show us. Border patrol vessels, simplified pictograms of boats, stereotypical nuclear families, and technical maps of border zones and operational areas. Notice what's missing? Actual people, real stories, individual experience. This absence isn't accidental. It's a visual mechanism that transforms migration from a human experience into an abstract problem to be solved. By focusing exclusively on symbols and administrative elements, the boats, the maps, the warning signs, the campaign strips migration of its human dimension. It becomes a technical issue to be managed rather than a complex human phenomenon. What makes this so impactful is how these visual choices work together. The combination of authoritative government voice and dehumanized visual representation creates a narrative where migration is purely a matter of border control and security, completely divorced from the lived experiences of people on the move. Let's examine how this poster employs our three visual cues. Look closely at how they handle the imagery of boats. I mean, the vessels are either reduced to simple pictograms, as we saw earlier, or shown from very far away, deliberately avoiding any depiction of human passengers. This visual technique gains even more power when combined with statements like, any vessel seeking to illegally enter Australia will be intercepted and safely removed beyond Australian waters. The use of the word safely here is telling. It presents boat removal as a clean administrative action, completely erasing the human consequences of these policies. The boats become mere icons to be managed rather than vessels carrying human lives. When we examine collectivization, we see how language and visual elements work together. The campaign repeatedly uses universalizing terms like anyone and everyone. Consider the phrase, the rules apply to everyone. It sounds neutral, even fair at first glance, but what it actually does is erase individual circumstances and human complexity. Even more revealing is how the campaign merges diverse groups together. I mean, families, children, unaccompanied children, educated and skilled, as if these vastly different situations could be reduced to a single category requiring one single response. The systematic decontextualization here is also striking. These materials exist in, I would call it, a historical and political vacuum. There's no acknowledgement of why people seek asylum, no recognition of global inequalities, no reference to historical legacies of colonialism or neocolonialism. Complex global migration patterns are reduced to simple, illegal journeys. By stripping away this crucial context, the campaign presents migration as a simple matter of rule breaking, rather than a complex human phenomenon shaped by historical and structural forces. What makes these materials so powerful is how these three elements, silencing, collectivization, and decontextualization, work together to create a seemingly neutral administrative approach to what is in reality a deeply human issue. Let's turn to one more example. And lastly, I will demonstrate the complex interplay between territorial and symbolic borders. The territorial borders are emphasized through militarized language. Consider phrases like Operation Sovereign Borders and tough border protection measures. The campaign repeatedly emphasizes physical boundaries through statements like Australia's borders are stronger than ever and references to Australian waters. This language choice exemplifies decontextualization by reducing complex migration patterns to a simple matter of military defense. But what these materials actually go But these materials actually go beyond mere geographical boundaries, demonstrating how symbolic borders function through visual and textual patterns, which I will show you now. Look, for example, at how they construct symbolic borders through cultural exclusion. The stark declaration, "You will not make Australia home," operates on two levels simultaneously. It's both a literal statement about physical entry and a powerful message about cultural belonging. This dual operation shows how collectivization works to create an us versus them narrative, while simultaneously silencing individual migrant experiences and motivations. The campaign further establishes moral boundaries by declaring, "People smugglers are dangerous criminals. People smugglers are lying," at the very bottom of one of the posters. This framing demonstrates another aspect of decontextualization by stripping away the complex global conditions that lead to human movement and to actually make people rely on those smugglers. It's not that black and white. This interweaving physical and symbolic borders perfectly illustrates what we discussed about border assemblage, how borders are created through various performative practices. The campaign positions Australia as a secure space requiring protection. But protection from whom? The answer is clear here: migrants. Through this framing, the campaign establishes a distinct hierarchy between citizens and migrants, placing citizenship in a position of privilege while declaring migrants as threats to be contained. It is interesting how the campaign uses multiple languages. While this might appear inclusive on the surface, it actually serves to globalize the exclusionary message. This multilingual approach demonstrates how border imaginaries can transcend national boundaries while maintaining the fundamental logic of exclusion. This campaign exemplifies what we've been discussing about how border imaginaries function in practice. By blending physical and symbolic borders through our three key visual cues, again, silencing, collectivization, and decontextualization, it naturalizes exclusionary practices while constructing a crisis narrative that frames migration as a threat requiring military response. The visual and textual methods work together to make these exclusionary practices seem not just necessary, but natural and inescapable. I will now use the same campaign and show you how it transcends national boundaries and is picked up by media outlets from the global north. Let's begin with with Australia's domestic context. So ABC News Australia, which is a national public broadcaster similar to Germany's public broadcasting institutions like ARD or ZDF, first reported on the Norway government campaign on 7th November 2016. It critically reflects on the government's targeting tactics, revealing how the campaign specifically targeted Australian residents based on their cultural and migratory backgrounds. Think about the implications of this for a moment. A government campaign supposedly aimed at deterring overseas asylum seekers from simultaneously speaking to its own residents. And this is where ABC's coverage becomes particularly telling, not for what it revealed, but for what it overlooked. ABC's reporting focused primarily on the domestic outcry over Facebook ads targeting Australian residents with migratory backgrounds. Let's analyze this coverage critically. The headline, "Government Facebook ads tell migrant Australians to deter family members from arriving illegally clearly centers around Australian citizens rather than on asylum seekers or refugees. It only shows a very limited part of one of the images from the actual campaign, largely reducing its actual content. That's basically all it shows. As you can see here, we can notice the technique of silencing and making the actual refugee invisible and excluding them from the discussion. First, it positions Australian citizens as the primary victims of the campaign, despite them only encountering these ads in their Facebook feeds. Second, it diverted attention from the campaign's actual targets, asylum seekers facing life-threatening circumstances, to a discussion about advertising ethics and domestic social media tactics. Third, it transformed a story about refugee deterrence into one about government overreach and social media targeting. What ABC's coverage missed was the campaign's fundamental role in advancing securitization discourse, as I've just shown you. ABC's coverage, by focusing on the targeting of Australian citizens, inadvertently reinforced these dehumanizing patterns. I cannot stress it enough. The real subjects of the campaign, refugees and asylum seekers, were once again pushed to the margins of the story, their experiences and humanity secondary to domestic political concerns. This layered failure of mainstream media coverage reveals broader patterns in how migration is often portrayed. Okay, to summarize. When media outlets focus on domestic reactions to migration policies, as in the case of ABC here, they often center citizen perspectives over refugee experiences, prioritize administrative and procedural concerns over humanitarian implications, transform stories about human rights into stories about government communication methods, and inadvertently reinforce the very securitization discourses they should be critically examining. This limitation in domestic coverage makes what happened next in the international context even more significant, as we see the campaign's visual elements being adopted and recontextualized across borders. But here's where it gets really interesting. As we move our focus to the international stage, we see how these visual elements begin to take on new life. Now, let's shift our analysis to examine how these border imaginaries transcend national boundaries. Deutsche Welle covered Australia's approach in the summer of 2015. Deutsche Welle reports on Australia's military-led Operation Sovereign Borders, of which the Norway campaign was a key communication component. This represents a significant transformation in how these policies were understood and shared through global North media. This coverage marked a pivotal shift in the narrative. Australia's domestic border policies were no longer just national measures. They were being reframed and examined as a potential blueprint for other nations. Deutsche Welle subtly questions the clean administrative narrative of the Australian government and positioned Australia's approach as a case study at precisely the moment when European nations were debating their own responses to increased migration. The timing of this coverage is striking. By reporting on Australia's celebration of turning back asylum seekers, Deutsche Welle brought these policies into direct conversation with European debates about migration control. What had been a domestic policy was now being scrutinized as a possible model for other countries' border practices. This is where it gets really interesting. This brings us to how the American right-wing media, Breitbart, repurposed this campaign, and also including the Deutsche Welle article that we just saw in its news reporting. Their article from August 2015, titled Australia Migrant Policy Success, 1 year without a successful people smuggling venture, appeared at a crucial moment. This headline alone reveals how Australia's approach was being reframed as a success story for right-wing audiences abroad. The timing wasn't coincidental either. Breitbart took those stark red warning posters, originally designed to deter asylum seekers in Asia, and recontextualized them to support arguments for stricter border controls in completely different geographical and political contexts. It presents Australia's tough border policies as a potential solution for Europe and the United States. Second, by celebrating Australia's success in preventing boat arrivals, Breitbart helped legitimize and internationalize this approach to border control. What we are witnessing here is really quite remarkable. These visual elements, the color scheme, the typography, the composition, became a kind of universal language of deterrence. They were detached from their original context and reframed as a success story, and then repurposed for different national debates about migration and borders. The visual patterns of secularization demonstrate an incredible adaptability, crossing cultural and linguistic boundaries with ease. This transformation reveals something profound about the power of visual communication and policy debates. The original campaign materials, designed for a specific purpose in Australia, became templates for a global approach to migration control and furthered the secularization discourse in the global north. They created what I might call a visual vocabulary of deterrence, a set of visual cues that could be understood and repurposed across different national contexts. I want to consider the broader implications here and pose a couple of questions. How do visual patterns of border control become internationalized? What makes certain visual elements so adaptable to different national contexts? And perhaps most importantly, what does this tell us about the role of media in shaping global approaches to migration policy? These questions are highly relevant as we continue to see similar patterns deployed in various contexts around the world. The legacy of campaigns like No Way lives on not just in Australian policy, but in how we visually communicate about borders and migration globally. Now that we've analyzed these media representations, let's dive deeper into how they actually create meaning. Specifically, we need to understand the role of metaphors in shaping our understanding of migration, borders, and security practices. Before I start sharing theoretical frameworks about metaphors, I would like to draw on your knowledge and insights. Take a moment to think about metaphors, particularly in visual representation. What comes to your mind? How do metaphors work to create meaning? Again, I would like you to share your thoughts in the Zoom chat. Please take a few minutes here to reflect and share your thoughts. Don't overthink it. It could be a single word, phrase, or complete sentence. I'll give you another minute or two, and then we'll continue. Okay, I look forward to reading and engaging with your answers later, hopefully. Let's explore how metaphors function within public discourse and shape our collective understanding of issues. First, it's important to understand that communities share cultural specific knowledge that informs how they interpret metaphors. Think about how certain references or comparisons might make perfect sense within one culture, community, or even one group of people, but would be puzzling to outsiders. A perfect example here is the inside joke. It works precisely because a specific group shares knowledge that outsiders don't have. If you're not part of that group, you miss the reference, the context, and ultimately the meaning. You can't map out the joke in your head because you lack the shared cultural knowledge that makes it meaningful. This is shared cultural knowledge. The shared cultural knowledge acts as a lens through which community members understand and evaluate metaphorical expressions. At the heart of metaphorical meaning is what Andreas Musolf calls a source domain. These are overarching concepts that serve as starting points. From these source domains, we develop more specific metaphorical meanings through what is called scenarios. As Musolf explains, and I quote him here because his definition is very precise, a scenario represents a set of assumptions made by competent members of a discourse community about typical aspects of a source situation. This includes assumptions about participants, their roles, expected storylines, and crucially, what outcomes are considered normal or abnormal, legitimate or illegitimate. Now, I would like to look more closely at how these scenarios develop through what Lakoff calls the source path goal schema. This schema is fundamental to how we structure metaphorical meaning. The source represents our starting point, the initial concept or domain. The path shows how meaning develops and transforms. And the goal represents where the meaning leads us in terms of understanding and response. What makes scenarios particularly powerful is how they branch out in affiliated meanings. They follow what Lakoff calls the source path goal schema, essentially mapping out how meaning develops from its origin to its destination. Within these scenarios, we find commonly held beliefs about people, objects, properties, relationships, and propositions that all stem from the original source domain. The real significance here, as Musolf argues, is that these metaphors in public discourse don't just describe, they actively shape public debates and how we conceptualize political topics. They do this by framing the attitudes and values that discourse communities consider acceptable or preferred. Let me illustrate the power of metaphors with an example we've encountered repeatedly. The use of water imagery in migration discourse. Think about terms like waves of migrants, or Flüchtlingswelle, or flooding across borders, or migration stream, or recall the 40+ posters from the Australian government featuring stormy waters and massive waves. These aren't random choices. They are part of a carefully constructed metaphorical framework. To understand how these metaphors work, let's break them down into 3 elements. The source, here is water and natural sources. The path, the progression through various water scenarios, waves, floods, tide. And the goal, framing migration as something that must be contained or controlled. This is not a neutral choice. What makes these water-based metaphors so powerful is how they activate specific scenarios in our minds. Let me further break it down for you. They present migration as an overwhelming, unstoppable natural force. They frame it as a threat that needs to be contained or held back. And they generate a sense of urgency and impending catastrophe. They subtly position receiving countries as victims who need to build defenses. Just as we build dams to control floods, the metaphor suggests we need barriers to control migration. Just as floods can overwhelm systems, migration is presented as something that will overwhelm social services. These metaphorical scenarios work to naturalize the securitization discourse. They make increased border security appear as the only logical response, just as flood barriers seem the obvious answer to rising waters. This perfectly demonstrates what Musolf argues about metaphors shaping public debates. These water metaphors aren't simply describing migration. They are actively framing our entire understanding of it. They influence which solution we consider appropriate and critically how we view the people involved. What makes these scenarios so powerful is their apparent self-evidence. If we're talking about floods, it appears logical that we need barriers and controls. But this framing does something profound. It obscures the complex human realities of migration and narrows our ability to consider alternative approaches. Okay. While water metaphors are perhaps the most common, let me show you another powerful example of how metaphorical framework shapes migration discourse. Let's shift our focus to Germany and examine a specific case from 2015 that demonstrates how culturally specific knowledge in Germany or in the global North media influences public understanding of migration. Consider the Stern magazine cover from the 27th of August 2015. Its title, Der Ansturm, or translated the inrush, offers us a perfect case study to further deconstruct these metaphorical meaning-making practices. By analyzing this example in detail, we can see how different types of metaphors work together to create powerful narratives about migration. Let me walk you through how this cover operates on multiple levels. So, I would like you to show how the Stern cover demonstrates the operation of culturally specific knowledge in global North media. Let's break down the metaphorical structure for which I've created a diagram to better understand such patterns. At the top, we have the cultural specific knowledge of the global North. You remember the inside joke? The cultural specific knowledge. When examining migration coverage, we need to understand that we are not seeing neutral reporting. Instead, we're observing representations filtered through shared cultural assumptions within global North media systems. For example, assumptions about nation states, border control, and what constitutes orderly versus disorderly movement. Just below, we have our source domain, which is mobility, movement, journey, and crowd. Look at how the cover's visual composition reinforces these concepts through three key elements. First, a dominant image showing masses of people attempting to board a train with only their heads visible. Second, a dramatic vocal point created by a child lifted above the crowd. And third, supporting images of frightened children and women in headscarves confronting police. The magazine's choice of title, Der Ansturm, in bold red letters is crucial here. This transforms our source domain into our scenario. Migration equals mass movement. The word itself suggests an uncontrollable force, while the subtitle, 800.000 Flüchtlinge verändern das Land, or 800,000 refugees change the nation, frames this as Deutschlands größte Aufgabe or Germany's biggest challenge. Following our path downward in the diagram, we can see how the visual and textual elements work together to create specific meanings. The chaotic composition implies a rush and lack of state control. The train boarding scene becomes a symbolic border crossing, and the mass of indistinguishable heads represents uncontrollable crowds. This pathway leads us to our goal, the naturalization of securitization discourse. By depicting migrants simultaneously as an overwhelming force and as vulnerable subjects, the cover constructs a narrative that justifies control and surveillance. It suggests these people need to be monitored and managed for their own good, as they appear incapable of rational action. Notice the reinforcing error in the diagram. This shows how such representations strengthen these interpretive frameworks over time. Each repetition of these metaphorical patterns makes the securitization response appear more logical and necessary. The cover doesn't just describe migration, it actively shapes how we understand it and what political responses seem appropriate. Okay, looking at the Stern cover, through our theoretical framework, we can see how multiple mechanisms of border construction operate simultaneously. Let's analyze how this single image demonstrates the interplay between visual typology, visual cues, and border assemblage. First, this is a clear example of what we called earlier type A, dehumanizing images that provoke anti-immigration sentiment. The visual choice to show only a mass of heads, making individuals indistinguishable, strips people of their individuality and humanity. This dehumanization works hand in hand with collectivization. Remember how we discussed the visual cue of treating migrants as an undifferentiated mass? Here we see it literally depicted. Individual stories and circumstances dissolve into what the magazine presents as an overwhelming crowd. The title, Der Ansturm, reinforces this collectivization, transforming individual human journeys into a single threatening mass movement. This is furthered by referring to the figure of 800,000 refugees. Again, one single category. The decontextualization we analyzed earlier is also at work here. Notice what's missing? Any explanation of why people are moving, any reference to global inequalities, any acknowledgement of Germany's own need for migration. Instead, we see migrants stripped of its historical and structural context, reduced to a moment of apparent chaos. This brings us to how border assemblage functions in this image. Remember how we discussed the interplay between territorial and symbolic borders? Here we see both at work. The territorial border is represented by the train scene, a literal point of transit. The symbolic border is constructed through the visual suggestion of order versus chaos, control versus lack of control. The metaphorical framework we just mapped supports this border assemblage by naturalizing a securitization response, just as we saw with the water metaphors in Australian media. This representation makes increased border control appear as the only logical response to what happens, to what's presented as uncontrollable movement. What makes this example so powerful is how these different elements, dehumanization, collectivization, decontextualization, and border assemblage, work together to create a seemingly coherent narrative about migration that demands control and management as its solution. I hope I could shed some light on the concepts using those images. But actually, I would like to end my presentation on a positive note by turning to an image that powerfully challenges the representations we've been discussing. One that offers alternative visual narrative and demonstrates how art can transform policy. This photograph shows Ali Durrani, who works under the pseudonym Eaten Fish. His story brings us full circle in our discussion of border imaginaries, but from a perspective that completely inverts the government narratives we've analyzed. Remember those stark red Australian government posters declaring, "No way, you will not make Australia home"? Durrani was precisely one of those individuals the campaign sought to deter. The irony here is profound. While government materials reduced boat arrivals to threatening silhouettes and branded them as illegals, Durrani's work reclaims and humanizes that narrative through his own lived experience. As an Iranian refugee, he lived the very journey depicted in those threatening government posters. Eventually, after his boat capsized, he experienced firsthand the tough border protection measures the campaign promised. He paid smugglers to escape to Australia. And then he spent 4 years in a detention center on Papua New Guinea Island, just off Australian shores, just off the radar. There he began creating cartoons, and not just as a way to maintain his sanity and process trauma, but as a form of resistance and testimony. His artwork did something quite remarkable. It transformed him from one of those anonymous figures in government posters into a powerful individual voice. His work gained international attention, appearing in major outlets like The Guardian, Washington Post, and BBC Online. More significantly, his artistic testimony contributed to a growing international pressure that ultimately led to 2 concrete changes. His being granted asylum in Norway, where he is living ever since, and the closure of the Papua New Guinea detention center in 2017. So real change. Let me show you one of Durrani's powerful artworks that exemplifies what we earlier classified as type 3B heroicizing images. Remember how we discussed this category as representations that show migrants as active agents who challenge the status quo? What makes this representation particularly powerful is how it literally positions us, the viewers, in the refugees' perspective. We're looking up from below at these global north actors, Australia, UK, New Zealand, who are turning their backs on us. This viewpoint is a direct challenge to the dominant visual patterns we've analyzed throughout this lecture. Instead of looking down at migrants through the usual global north gaze, we're forced to look up at bureaucratic figures who are visibly disconnected from the human reality below. Look at how Durrani constructs this partial arrangement. Notice how these officials are entirely absorbed in their own concerns, their backs turned to the questions and pleas rising from below. This visual choice brilliantly captures how global North media and political discourse often operate, concerned only with their own perspective, their own administrative processes, their own narratives about migration. The labeled codes become almost the labeled white codes become almost like corporate branding, reducing complex national responses to migration into simplified logos of bureaucratic indifference. By positioning them atop a giant hand reaching upward, Durrani creates a powerful metaphor for resistance and agency. This isn't passive. This isn't a passive victimized hand. It's actively reaching up, challenging the authority above. The speech bubbles, somebody help me, where's the fair, is there anybody, demonstrate key characteristics of type 3B representations: resilience, defiance, and active questioning of power structures. These voices challenge the decontextualization we observed in government campaigns by insisting on recognition of human rights and justice. Through this inverted perspective, Durrani transforms what we typically see in type 1A dehumanizing representations into a powerful critique. The collective mass isn't the refugees this time, it's the bureaucrats above, their individuality merged into their institutional roles, collectivization. This reversal of collectivization serves as a perfect example of how type 3B, heroicizing images, can turn dominant visual patterns back on themselves, creating counter-discourse to prevailing border imaginaries. Durrani's work represents both personal testimony and political intervention, demonstrating how alternative representations can challenge dominant narratives, ascribe agency to the depicted, and potentially to real meaningful systemic change. I love this cartoon. So, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you take some valuable things from this lecture today. I hope I could still make it a little bit engaging despite being pre-recorded. It's a little bit awkward, but I hope it still works out. And I'm excited to see how it turns out.